Hello, everyone. I first of all must thank Professor Ajith and the Green Building Council for the invitation extended to give a presentation, and so happy to accept because it's sharing some ideas and also perhaps sharing someone else's ideas with you through me. I believe it's very important and so make use of this opportunity. So let me share the slides. I hope you can see the screen. Are you hearing me? Hello.
Yes, sir. They are hearing you.
Can you see the screen?
Yes, clear.
Right. 3P and the pandemic. When the question was asked, I thought, okay, why not? This is a green talk. So it's about 3P. And we are in a very, very different, difficult, but interesting, also challenging times. So we are facing a pandemic. So I coined the two and I said, okay, let's discuss this in this short period of time. And the second part of the topic, that is the pandemic, I suppose is very clear to everybody. I am just showing you the Johns Hopkins University's dashboard, which we all probably from day one or from the very beginning was looking at to see the numbers and then how things are heading, specifically when more countries were really coming into the play rather than China or perhaps one other country alone. Now it's gone across. And March 11th, WHO declared a pandemic, and I think that's the day that also Sri Lanka found our first Sri Lankan with COVID-19. The day the WHO declared this whole thing as a pandemic. So what we see when you see the dashboard is not a very pleasant thing. About 3 million people now as affected, but of course, some of them have actually been cured. But then WHO again issued a statement saying, okay, we do not guarantee immunity. That's another open question that they have put out, say from yesterday, so that we cannot guarantee that, okay, I had the disease, I was confirmed okay, but am I carrying on the immunity for some time? Now another interesting topic has surfaced. But what we also see a very bad number, like 2 lakhs people dead within this period of, if you take from Wuhan, when December 31st, we're talking about only about 4 months, lives snatched away due to this disease and a virus. So we see this, and because it's almost across the planet, it's a pandemic, and we are faced with this pandemic. Of course, we have to see the TBL or the 3P, the first part of the topic. And as an environmentalist, and also we are very, very fascination or passion on how to make the planet move while also talking about this quality of life, development, etc. There was this individual who coined this. So we must, while we value the environment, some people actually by way of expressing their opinion, way of putting it firmly on the agenda with a terminology, has solidified our way of thinking and our way of tackling the problem. So John Elkington actually did it in 1994 when he came up with the triple bottom line concept. And he showed that with his book on cannibals with forks. He was arguing what an earlier Polish philosopher came up and said, a Polish poet. So if you're still using forks, or the cannibals just migrating to forks, but even still just consuming the humans, the cannibalism, is that progress? Kind of the open question, right? So you change maybe the way of doing things, but your basics have not changed. And he was questioning. So he was asking that we need to not look at the very prevalent single bottom line, which was the financial or the economic bottom line. And he was pushing us to accept the environmental bottom line and the social bottom line, so that those words and concepts have stayed with us. We have the triple bottom line approach, and it's been with us for some time, the days of 1994. A year later, he actually went ahead with the 3P. Of course, it's the same TBL, but it was probably a little bit easy to remember. So 3P was the people, the planet, the profit. So where the planet was about the environmental bottom line, the people was the social bottom line, and we had the profit as economic or the financial bottom line. We can still question, we can always question, okay, the philosophy, the need has been expressed. We are very, very focused that we must do something about this. So many things must have been written and continue to be written. Yet our approach to this whole process, what we are doing, we still have to ask. So I don't think the environment was, for most of us, the majority of us, is still the number one priority. One bottom line still sticks with the majority. That is the financial or the economic bottom line. And we really need to be conscious of this as we move forward as well. But what about this time? I mean, are we getting an added idea or an emphasis that, okay, people, we just cannot ignore this for anymore, that you have this burning issue and what to do. And you must take a step of this, a note of this. So I'm, again, a sentence that I have been constantly mentioning from Einstein. Dahl was actually a retired vice president of ESO Norway. It was an interesting one. It really rhymes well with the thinking. He said, socialism collapsed because it did not allow prices to tell the economic truth. So the pillars of socialism, the communism may have really fallen, the concept of some of this thinking, because maybe they were not telling the economic truth. It was not to be propagated for a period. I mean, like, to move on. Then, of course, he suggested as a more important one, capitalism may collapse because it does not allow prices to tell the ecological truth. From economic truth of prices telling exactly what it means from the to ecological truth, that is internalizing so many externalized parameters or the values that we have forgotten on the way. Now he's attributing capitalism may collapse because we no longer, we cannot ignore this ecological truth. And is this pandemic a way of showing the ecological truth as well? That's a question to ask. And we may have to think about it. So I'm just pushing some ideas, again, learning from others to see the relevance of this concept of what Einstein, and it's interesting that he came from a very, very premier petrochemical company, the world's top companies at the time. So he would have dealt with oil and fossil fuel pushed economy. For him to come out and tell this, he would have had some serious understanding at some point in time. Something, again, for us to take in. It's also interesting to think, if we are not facing this pandemic and not confined to indoors, that we would have celebrated the 50 years of the Earth Day movement. And that was a young senator from United States of America. So Gaylord Nelson. He's young. He's not a senior member of the U.S. Senate, but he thought, and while facing issues on the day, specifically like an oil spill onto the beaches of U.S., and thinking differently, though benefiting perhaps from this enhanced quality of life, the income, etc., he thought that, no, this cannot go on, and that we need to push this environmental thinking, and that we had probably recalibrate the way we do things. And that just happened in 1970 on April 22nd. And it's interesting to think that was in a university, he roped in the university and he roped in both parties. So there was a bipartisan movement. It was not a political drive. And it was between, for the students, it was between an exam, the break, spring break, and when before the exam starts on a day, that they just moved in with this concept. So it was not moved actually Earth Day on the time. And the point was, when it gathered momentum, he realized the importance of it and started really pushing the concept across the world. Though it started from US in a university and it was confined to the United States. But we would have celebrated 50 years of advocacy. Greta Thunberg would have been there because this year's theme was on climate action, because that's the burning issue. But it's interesting, even though that was a burning issue, people by and large, we have not been moved by the urgency to act. We have seen that from the world's #1 economy, who went back on the Paris Agreement. We saw that in Australian fires, how the situation, how to protect, or rather it's going to vanish. And the importance of the coal to the economy was very much in evidence in the way the decision-making was done and the fighting was done. But it's also interesting to see how the same system is tackling the pandemic, way different. So it's things to learn in Australia, but across how we face problems and how we learn from each of these scenarios, and our responses define the future. And when we have a global crisis, perhaps it's even more important how we manage or how we act during this situation, our response, and how we act in a transparent manner, and how we communicate. So unfortunately, in critical time, you're not able to kind of like celebrate the Earth Day, but that doesn't mean the emphasis of this we have to forget, and we can actually connect the overall aim of the Earth Day, taking the environment as a whole. And I think that message is still relevant, and it's quite relevant even in this pandemic. Again, it's interesting to think Elon Musk, and I don't shy away from technology progress. I mean, we probably are much more, I consider myself more of a brown environmentalist, not a green in that true sense. That's fault of mine. But the point is, we see the technology and we are kind of like wowed by the technology options. And Elon Musk actually in January was telling that about his going to Mars program this January, while the virus would have been coming out of Wuhan and was spreading, thanks to technology as well. You have to support the virus's movement to the technology. It's the technology, the logistics that provided its massive spread. Of course, the basics of the biological sciences would have applied. But Elon Musk, as reported on this January 16th, was talking about sending 1 million people to Mars. And in fact, he was talking about the very first one, not the meeple, but the model, the first trial version of the rockets was to be looked in this September in 2020. So it's interesting what Elon Musk may be right now doing, whether he has also been confined into his room thanks to this, the virus. So stopping all of this type of thinking, these tracks, while we were hoping to move on to Mars in 2020, now we are suddenly gone into our houses and closing the doors and worrying quite a lot by many people to even come out of the road. So it's interesting times indeed when we think like this. But of course, this is probably a small technology stop. But again, some may be thinking, okay, we can afford to do away with the environment in this planet because we are going to populate another planet. But we know that's not going to be that easy. And not all humanity will benefit. So we cannot be selfish in our approach. So that's not exactly relevant from an environmental point of view. But interesting thing, we were planning going to Mars, but now we can't get onto the road. So it's the SARS coronavirus 2, and this is just the second number what the WHO has given. So even if you take the SARS coronavirus 1, which was our SARS epidemic, none of that, no the Ebola, the SARS, the MERS never reached pandemic status. They didn't go into that pandemic status. But anyway, they actually held some parts of the world and really confused many economies for a period of time. Even in SARS, it was like 3 years for that period. So this is something, this virus, which we can't see. So we had to take the lessons from the different sciences. And we say we can obviously see with the technology today, because we have the microscopes coming from the nanotechnology domain, where we can visualize this. And this is about 9 to 110 nanometers that we see the SARS virus. So this is a coronavirus. So it's talk about coming from the animal kingdom, the zoonotic viruses. And it's interesting to read about some people who speaks on how they have worked on about 200 deadly zoonotic viruses, coronaviruses specifically. So that means we're just seeing 1 or 2. And the second one really has caused us enough problems. And it's, for some people and a lot of people, serious disease and life basically have been taken away. So it's not been that easy from a virus just going around the world and mutating slowly. Some genetics talks about every 15 days, there's a mutation from the current studies that's taking place. So we do have this virus, and of course, at the point, a lot of people some of them have many theories, but generally the focus is on this came from as a zoonotic virus, and probably from bats, and then why probably another animal that is was infecting the human. The problem actually starts when human-to-human transmission takes place. Otherwise, we do have certain viruses which are still not having, but transmitting taking place from animals to us, but not human to human going. So the spread is very different. The spread is not taking place as it happens now. So from that, so in the Chinese, the seafood market and the live animals and so on, we talked about very open market. That probably had been the cause of it. And that is the Hunan, the seafood wholesale market. That's where we have been pointing the finger. But again, what we have to think of it as, that's been a human practice or human behavior. We have kind of short-circuited, or we have brought in animals. We have been consuming sometimes live and maybe raw, so not cooking. And while science have showed us the presence of the virus as a virus. And so somehow, unfortunately, from that point, one managed to get to across to the human. And then we had this atypical pneumonia, and then that 41 patients initial cluster. And from that, it's pandemonium, basically. It's going around. So we have to look at our way of behavior as well. And that is where the environmental aspect comes in, because we are taking the habitat in some way, and we are bringing them right into our midst. And some of our practices may not be very, very good in terms of you're talking about this possible disease transfer. So we need to understand some of this. So that's, and also even in this, with the DNA analysis, the genetic analysis, some even points to parts of the DNA being part of the Pangolia or the anteater. So a lot of science at play now, studying the virus, studying the mutations. That is something very interesting, because when SARS happened, it took about a year for the genetic unraveling. And we know how our own scientist, Professor Malik Piris in Hong Kong, saved the day, coming out from the rudimentary setup and then working to and getting this data out. And he became basically a hero. And he's been recognized for his contribution. And we should also recognize his contribution subsequently to Sri Lanka in terms of supporting our abilities to grow in terms of respond. And probably the way we act today owe something to him for some advice that have been taken place. So that is what we have to think. It came from the animal kingdom and crosses the human. I'm not discounting that we are an animal, but we consider ourselves quite superior. But now, as Elon Musk is finding, we find a virus coming from this bat has been much more of a problem. So we need to probably look at some of these practices. China did ban, moved away, but when you see these certain practices have still now returned back. Any way to think and have to recalibrate perhaps some of our ways of behavior if you understand the risks are too high. So things may be happening right now. I mean, we ourselves know the first animal that we domesticated, the dog, and we spent quite a lot of money on the rabies vaccine in Sri Lankan terms in our medical bill. So in some of these things, we are aware of the vaccine is there. So we are very comfortable with knowing that we have a solution if the transmission takes or some disease takes place. But we also know that things like dengue, that we are still facing an uphill struggle. So the mosquito as a vector. So these are things to learn, and I think all of us have probably taken a serious lesson now on the immense potential of virus transmission and how people or how system can go down in very quick time. That's a huge lesson for many of us that we probably have to think and learn from and adjust ourselves to, but then have to work on. So anyway, that is this very brave statement. And that's the only way I think the way we have been told and the way the science today tells that humanity will beat the pandemic for sure, but only after when most of the population is vaccinated. And until then, the life will not return to the normal. Now, it's a very, very serious sentence to accept because you can't put the timeline. We know the science have advanced. We know by not really failing to act as per the Bill Gates famous TED talk, that's an easy one to digest, rather than digesting a lot of scientific specific specialized literature. We didn't act. So but somehow some of the earlier work that was done, and we know with Zika, the virus was stopped by the company in France because the money ran out. And when they identified the population by and large as being kind of have managed to achieve herd immunity, and then there was no need and the money dried for the vaccine process to go on, so that it was not developed. But what is known today is we have the platforms that were being getting developed for SARS and the rest. Ebola, of course, has a vaccine. That was a very fast-tracked development, and serendipity played a role, I think, from Canadian science. But again, for this, the scenario is that when are we going to get the vaccine? It's not just from the lab, but from production facilities where it will be able to be distributed to the majority who needs, or to the population that needs it. And then only we can say, look, okay, we have overcome that. And that's probably the scientific answer. But when we have a question of from today to then, what are we going to do, how we are going to do? So maybe the way of reacting, the way of response probably have to follow the way we have done, the basic norms of behavior that we have been asked to follow, the respiratory hygiene, social distancing, the new norms that we have with us. So it's interesting. What is interesting again from an environmental is this famous, probably the picture where the population is growing. We should not forget, we are talking about an antiviral scenario today, but because of an antibacterial, our population was going up starting from like 1942 when we came up with the penicillin. Again, Alexander Fleming, it was a demonstration, was 1927-78 period. So it took some time for the drugs to come out and to make available to every one of us. So we still use penicillin and penicillin derivatives for our purposes, but this is a tremendous development in terms of infection control and as an antibiotic. So we have an antimicrobial, So maybe this may be another inflection point. How we work was not the vaccine only, but even if you're talking about therapeutics, maybe that's the medicine jargon. But another challenge is upon us, certainly, to address. But we must understand that science and technology has really benefited us in this way of trying to overcome some of the problems that we faced, and enabled us to expand and to enjoy a certain different way of quality of life. And we continue to push. But the problem is we should understand our responsibilities too. And that's where we probably have failed, definitely. In terms of understanding our responsibilities, we have been just consuming without responsibility factored in. Another good thing perhaps is that science, the importance of science has come into play in this. And we have to take decisions based on science. And environmental science probably has to figure in very strongly too, because we've not been able to demonstrate in terms of climate action the importance of science that strongly. Here we have no choice. Still, you see the science and the establishment at loggerheads or having difference of opinion. And I think it's all the more serious when we see situations like this coming probably from one of the #1 science states. Yet we see comments of this nature. It's very hard to erase once you have said maybe, but there has to be, in decision making at this time, the science is becoming quite critical. Dr. Fauci being the epidemiologist, the chief, the principal scientist that walks on with the president in USA. But I think it's a very different scenario in Australia when you see the same type of news conference. So from a science point, and we need money to do some of the environmental work, remember those people who reduce budget for science and R&D, they want to talk with us. And maybe this story is true in Sri Lanka today too. Science is being looked at, and science viewpoints are taken, and asking for inventions and so on is happening. So this is interesting. This is from University of Sri Jayawardenepura, Professor Neelika's group, probably the front line, performing to their best, working overtime. And there are so many medical personnel, scientists, public health, and everybody is working in here, in Sri Lanka too. My mind went back when I was just looking at this, trying to formalize the presentation very quickly, to a presentation I remember from Professor Sunil Chandra in 2018, when he was inducted to the National Academy of Sciences, Sri Lanka. And I contacted him yesterday, so he very happily shared the slides with me. And again, I'm just showing how important that we ourselves do some of the work. It's important. I mean, if you look at how Professor Malik Pires acted at the time, that story is very inspiring. So I remember Sunil mentioned about bats are sources of most of the emerging infections at the time. This was a presentation made in 2018. I'm using 3 of his slides now, and it's somewhat chilling also. What he said was that when our human population growth takes place and our impact on environment and climate change takes place, we do move into their habitat, or they move closer to us, and then these barriers to transmission probably become less, and probably we have sanitized ourselves in different ways, so we probably become much less resistant or more susceptible to some of these transmissions. That's probably maybe the things happen. We know some people died of flu in some continents at some points, but they were very resistant to others. They had built-in immunity, but they had no immunity for some of the other things that came on from elsewhere. So he had these 4 lines. Viruses can cause devastating effects on society, and they are a continuing threat, and they are spread by global travel. And how relevant and how accurate these 3 sentences are, these 3 bullet points are. When you think about it, today our society, the global society, is in lockdown or under curfew or in real serious trouble. And people are seriously worried. So it's been a continuing threat. WHO telling that even if you had the disease, immunity may not be still sure. So it's a continuing threat. And even in the middle of this virus, there was this small story that surfaces on the hantavirus from China. Of course, we do have the hantavirus, and we continue to read about 200 deadly coronaviruses available and 500 bat viruses people have isolated, so on. So it's a continuing threat and spread by global travel. We have the example right now. And worrying or chilling is a virus has been considered with humanity's ultimate rival. So Professor Sunil Chandra may elaborate more from the sciences, but it's also interesting to remember the father of transplantation had a very interesting statement about a virus. Virus is a bad news wrapped in a protein. So it was mentioned by Peter Bedwar, who is considered the father of the organ transplant immunology concept. So anyway, he said, virus is bad news wrapped in protein. And it has been extremely bad news to so many of us today. And something yet still most of us cannot see. So it's almost going back to his presentation, 2018. It's a very interesting slide. And he mentioned these 3, that our health, we have to look at not just ecosystem health, we have to look at the animal health. So human health become interfacing on these things. So if their habitats are destroyed, if the habitats are disturbed and they move in and we have no choice, or we bring them in and we disturb our systems, we need to understand lots more when we try to manage. So we have another kind of these interactions of 3 spheres, 3 circles, and a whole new way of looking at our health. So it's not something, a zoo is not something we need to think of it as it has really serious relevance of a difference note now. And I remember his last slide when he put in, he said, after this presentation in about a couple of days' time, I'm going to Peradeniya to the garden because they have found some bats and with rabies. So it's been a very original find. And you have this Gunnorua bat Lyssa virus. So that was in my memory, actually. This was the slide that was in my memory because he said, and I think that I was thinking of a true scientist, you are continuously understanding or knowing how things are happening. Okay, I found this thing happening. I must go and watch, go and study and go to that place. So we do have this Gunnorua bat Lyssa virus. And he was talking about this rabies version having problem to the bats. So the first find in Sri Lanka is now a Lyssa virus isolated from the brains of the in Sri Lanka. So what do we have new? I mean, are we to look at only one direction of China? What may happen? I mean, when is the next time? And MERS didn't come from China. MERS came from Middle East, from camels, and that's a transfer took place from there. So that's about the emerging threat, and it's interesting to see how important our science also has to be, and to be on top. So we have been in the past few days, we have been working on this, the curves, right? All of us have been trying to support to get into this, the blue one, where we see not this, the way we do our measures, control, we want to push this curve to this because we understand this healthcare system capacity. And we need to keep it below that line. The moment it crosses the line, you have a different kind of chaos. And that's what some countries have really shown. We are in their way of management of the situation. And so it's maths in practice of a sort. It's predictive modeling. and rest of the science, rest of the from the medical level and from the basic sciences throwing out data, and how do we plan? And the decision makers have to go with that. So you need to continuously revalidate your model because it's so dynamic. And after a mistake, the curve becomes a different. So again, something to think about. As Sri Lankans are always innovative in a way, so it's also interesting. We have the Kondakaum and the Munkaum scenario to remember the two curves. So it's very creative. Probably this way we can understand the need to go from, even though we may prefer the Kondakaum, but we have to go for the Munkaum. I don't know, it's a personal preference, but the situation is, we remember we need to flatten the curve. So that's terminology. So how do you flatten the curve? And we need to look at healthcare system capacity, but that's for the decision makers and for communicating to us the need to take caution. And that's why we need to take caution. So we need to understand how this dotted line plays out with respect to each and every country. So we have gone into, from an environment point, we see the messages like the world has closed down for renovation, grand reopening soon. Is this grand reopening is back into the same old world? And we'll continue to do as before? That's the question. Some have been very, very positive talking about this return of natural rhythms, right? And they're talking about the wild habitat, wildlife moving into city centers, and so on, that nature reclaiming back what we have taken from them. That's been a theme also from an environmental point of view. But again, that's a lesson we have to take, because we have seen his own pictures from Trincomalee and some other places. Trincomalee, of course, the deer seems to be obeying the social distance, interestingly. So, okay, they are there. We are not to be found. We are inside. So it's interesting. But obviously and definitely, this status of affairs is not going to go for a long time, and we are itching to get out. But the lessons have to be taken. So what we know is, from a pollution point of view, this is a grand social experiment that we can't do every day. And we have been forced to do that. So these lessons are pretty valuable. And that's something we should take on. So what we know is that from the state of the global air, or the disease burden reports that come in every year, that we have the air pollution as a #1 killer, right? From NCDs, it's in the top 5. And we talk about 8 million people across the world, the lives being snatched away due to air pollution. And that should not happen, because that's not a disease that they didn't generate it themselves. They were affected by, and they're succumbing to that effect that was caused due to an external scenario. And it's not of their own making. They may have contributed a bit, but it's a collective scenario that is influencing many people to die. And so this experiment is indicating that we can reset in some way. So we know about it, we have spoken about it, but okay, we have not really addressed. We have been very slow to move away. We're very happy to move with vehicles. We want electricity. We don't care how it comes as long as it's cheap. And we don't make a conscious effort to move in a different direction, taking on a little bit of extra cost at the beginning, so that we know, okay, end result is not only good, it's of high quality. But we have been more concerned about cheap kilowatt for our value, and then how to move from kilometers in cheaply. So we have paid a big price, but we have not been able to take consciously strong decisions. But today, we probably can understand something about, because of the social experiment, about all the issues from the heart disease of the IHDs to the respiratory tract scenarios that have taken place. So all the air pollution related scenarios that's come is being attributed to simple dust in air. So particulate matter of 2.5 microns, the submicron particles. And so we have a very good understanding of the hazard scenario, hazard nature, the risk as well. But we have been carrying on without much risk mitigation. We would be happy if we can do something, but we have not aggressively done it. Here we have a scenario that we have changed. We have seen how change, if you make this decision, how the change is going to happen. And then the question is, how do we sustain it with different policies as we move forward? So most of the strongest evidence comes from environmental satellites. Thanks to technology, we now have Earth monitoring satellites. A couple of dozens may be doing that across, even though we don't have our own one. So we have seen very clearly with respect to the pollutants like nitrogen dioxides that we have seen it in terms of Italy in this case, the March 2019 and March 2020, it's a very different picture. It's in Italy was one of the strong lockdown economies that went in a little later, but even though they did it, and so the pollution picture is there. But is this whether this gives a complete picture is something we have to take. And so that I will go into another scientist of ours. So when we see the ground level air monitoring from Central Environment Authority, so this is their AQI display unit. This picture is from 27th, is January 26th. We have had some moderate pollution in terms of particulates. And when you see some of the apps, if you're using some of these apps that we have, Plume, Airwell, and so on, we get these for various places. So you see Western Province and Javadnagama from Battaramulla, very high unhealthy on February 29th. And I just took it today, April 27th, while Javadnagama comes out very good in the green, but Western Province, from wherever the sensors are in this data collect point, it comes still at high. So I posed this question once saying that most of the time when you took these apps, we find Sri Lankan air pollution has not really gone down. All the apps tend to give values of high pollution or moderate. So our curfew doesn't seem to have affected the pollution. Remember, we are now taking just the March, April, the data that as we come along. And the apps indicates a problem. Though I cannot see cars, I cannot hear sound, this noise. And when you come to actually from the actual data on the CEA, there's a very good air quality measurement station at Palavatta. They are really demonstrating the PM10. The blue is 2019, and the kind of the violet is on 2020, and you can see the drops. It's not an analysis. You can look at the numbers, but you can see somewhat there's distinctly a difference between the last March and this March. Same goes with the trend, and that is in the same month. As you move on the day by day, we see a drop. So maybe the more the curfew and the more the cars go out, we can see the recording to show a drop in particulate matter. And this is PM 2.5 and PM 10. So you can see the blue and the yellow. So it clearly shows the linear model, the drop. So very clearly showing that this is nitrogen dioxide, again showing the drop. This is day to day, not comparing between the last year, but we can see a drop. And I think it's fair enough to think that, yes, we are not traveling. Most of the vehicles are out. So we are not having the nitrogen dioxides, which are actually coming from combustion, man-made. So we know that's a very clearly a pollutant that we create seriously. So it has to go down. Otherwise, yes, we have to see something wrong. Something's not quite right. But it was interesting when asked the same question tweeted, because you're at home, you can't do much other than looking at some of this data published. You cannot enjoy the outside in whether to check all the changes. But Dr. Arif mentioned that he went back and looked at the situation. What he said was, no. Don't always immediately address this as something that is as a result of the curfew. Think of the other picture as well. And he went ahead and checked on the last years and demonstrated that it's not exactly the COVID that today's March and April is almost like the 2018-19 also they show lower values. So there may be a contribution from this problem of issue of no transport, etc. But the situation of weather, we need to understand as well. So you can see that we need to understand the superposition of the climate scenario. And the same thing came up in US. Now, again, the pandemic, this scenario gives us a huge opportunity in research because this is a once in a lifetime situation. But probably we are not into the game as the same situation as some of the other countries where you can see a huge amount of immediately research being published. So this is a case in Nature that comes out why pollution is plummeting in some cities but not others. And in this article also, the researchers were pointing to what Dr. Subaya was actually pointing. And they were showing that the weather has an effect. So we had to look at, so it so happens the pandemic and this time period is superimposed on a kind of weather patterns as well. And we see a drop. Of course, there has to be some contribution, definitely, no question about it, as you can see from the satellite images. So only Los Angeles is showing a clear downward trend. And even in that, its article mentions about some heavy excessive rain. So there's a lot of things to do, but we certainly know that, definitely know that we are not contributing. So nature looks resilient, and we can understand about that. So I think a good answer is the Venice, this picture that people keep on talking about. The water is so clear. You can see the jellyfish on the Venice canals and so on. But maybe that shows our human activity being so high, but maybe we can, the nature has a way of coming back or responsive. The moment your stressors are removed, they have in areas you have an ability to react fast. And that may be because when you have these gondolas going up and down, you disturb the sediment. So the whole view becomes, it's muddy, there's turbulence, and then some of these fish is not going to come and move in this direction. So, but simply zero transport, system get cleared very much. So we need to understand the impact of various parameters, the stressors, to really say that the nature has, I don't think the nature has done a reset. Yes, there has been a certain contribution, but we can learn a lot from this situation. But I wanted to complete the last part. COVID-19 has a positive hand in many ways, also in some areas. I'm conscious of those people who are suffering and the people who are working nonstop. COVID expected to involve the whole planet and no way of we had to understand the way of self-isolation. And it has been predicted to be a high-risk scenario. And it requires to act together and with understanding. And today at home, we are also understanding with food and everything, how to have this very famous comment that we were talking about sustainability, from less. We are getting a new learning about how to have more from less. We don't have the same way of consuming, definitely, I hope. We have no choice, so we don't. So we understand how to get more from less. But do we have a situation, pandemic, this scenario is a blip in a way. Science will overcome, but it will extract it all. But we have a situation like climate change, where we need to do the same 4 things to solve it. We need to understand the whole planet approach. It's going to suffer together. It's a very, very high risk scenario. And if you don't work together and work with understanding, it's going to be a problem. And a sustainability is all about more from less for more. So it's very interesting. COVID-19 has some positive lessons that we need to extrapolate to climate. And interestingly, that seems to be also about 2 curves. We have been more learning about these curves from the EPID point of view. Climate change is also about 2 curves. If you go on business as usual, the temperature is going to rise. If you take measures, we can control the temperature rise. So interestingly, it's about going to this blue curve. How do you push from the wrong curve that we are in to the next curve? And this COVID-19 gave us an opportunity to do a course correction seriously. So think about it, it's a very interesting thing. And that is why we talked about environment having a very close connectivity, pandemic P1, because we have been destroying habitat, and climate change has led to destroying habitat, and then the habitat and us moving together and having the problem. So the last point is, we have to think, when we bounce back, we should not do the same things that we have been doing. And that option is there. Not right now, people are drawing curves of this nature. How do we bounce back? And how do we measure success? In this, we do not have the environment in mind. Please remember this. This comes from an economic analysis. I don't want to go into details because this can take some discussion point, but the screen dump or some, you can easily check it, but it's a very interesting one. People are planning the right curve from economic point, how to rebound. Success coming from a very rapid growth like A4, right? What you need is an A4 thing is economic way. And how do you bring the environmental in? So we need to have the human values moving forward. Otherwise, we are forgetting the 3P, the people part. Economy is not the end point for the human behavior. So design and management of certain hospital systems we are seeing, even up to the COVID, we have taken a very economic decision. So overwhelming, some of the systems are coming from the way the economy was managed, rather forgetting the potential issues. We can see the stimulus packages where they are turning out to be some corporate bailouts. We can see the food banks operating. If you take in US, you use your car to go to the food bank and you see the queues. So the people factor, how do we have that, that we do understand the value, and we may take the certain decisions based on, okay, I cannot, basically I have to turn this person away because he has a lower chances of success. And I need to give attention to the younger person. So such thinking, the triage is happening. It's a question that we need to think about. And we also have taken industries where we have taken that these are carcinogenic, we are reopening factories to get the PPs out. So there's an example of ethylene oxide. The factory in Georgia is coming on and temporarily is putting aside the use of ethylene oxide for the sterilization of PPEs. So the urgency of the current situation is pushing us to do different things. We must remember that. And in our own cells, we may be now burning quite a lot of waste away. And the interest on moving away from plastics, today we are consuming plastics at a much more seriously today and burning them as well. So a couple of points, we need to get manufacturing. So one thing, if we can go back to ethanol into fuel, if we can get into rice, into bread, how much of things we can. We need to put manufacturing into Sri Lanka, shortening supply chains, reducing the greenhouse gas emissions, and making them more green manufacturing, and going for green fuels as fast as possible. And these opportunities have been there, worked on for a long time, right? And if we want more high tech, we can go for biohydrogen, but that will be slow in coming from garbage, but it's possible. So biofuels, we should think. So alcohol was one of those things we said. Food and agriculture, the very last one. We need to work on this. We need to ensure that we can have our own food. Our per capita expenditure is very expensive, 52%. We have endured losses like 45% for last 71 years, even more. Our import expenditure for food is about 200 billion rupees plus. And unfortunately, our nutritional status is also very poor. Wasting and stunting is at a very high level. Currently, Sri Lanka is sandwiched between Eritrea and Somalia. That's not a good thing. And all of these actions, if you reset as per the pandemic, there can be a much more different Sri Lankan economy, which we can really look at with the 3P mindset rather than with just 1P. So food security and nutrition security can be enhanced through the activities that will actually support in our way of adding to resilience for things like this. So finally, let me conclude with a sentence of Einstein: look deep into nature and then you will understand everything else. And he's not somebody who talks much on the nature in a way. He said, thank you.